blow some shit up?
Let's do it.
All right. What's your kickoff question? I know you have one locked and loaded.
This is my favorite part. Okay, so who is the person who has made the biggest impact in your life to date?
My grandfather.
Okay. Why?
Yeah, I mean, without going too deep into it, I guess just for time's sake. But I mean, he spent a lot of time with him when I was young, and with both my grandparents. And I think from an impact perspective, he played a very big role in how I see the importance that I place on integrity. He carried himself the way he moved through the world. I have a lot of respect for, and he carried himself with a lot of integrity and was well respected and was someone you could trust and rely on. And that's something that I try to emulate in my life. And he's no longer with us, but yeah, that I think carrying yourself with a lot of integrity and being someone that people can trust and rely on is something that I work really hard to do. And there's other people that certainly informed that and helped me, see the importance of that in my life. But he definitely played a leading role in that. And I think that's in large part like how I think about business too. I think, he was very much of the era of like, take people at their word and like, a handshake seals the deal. And I know that's not how business is done, but I think you can still carry yourself with the same level of integrity where like that could be good enough, right? Like if I tell you I'm going to do something, you could take it to the bank and like, I will always follow through. And, and coming through for people, like he showed up for a lot of people all the time. And that's how I try to carry myself, in my life, but, in our businesses as well. And in terms of how I think about my role as a leader. So yeah, he was a special guy.
That's incredible. And
how about you? You have to answer now too.
Oh yeah, I always forget about this part. I think lately the story, I've told the story a couple of times. But when I was like right before I launched into coaching, I had started speaking. It's probably not like the biggest impact, but it's been one that's been very relevant lately. But I started speaking and telling like my story about just like a little bit of like my teen mom story, told a little bit of like my the brain condition I had and that like healing process and story. And I remember getting off stage and like this woman was like, that's incredible. I'm so grateful to hear your story, but it's really mean that like you don't have a way for us to like change our lives the way you did. And like, you don't have anything to give us. And I just was like I was so taken back by like her honesty. And like, also she was right. Like I was telling this like inspirational story, but had zero tools for them. And I remember I was like trying to figure out what my next business move was. Like I had sold my first company, stepped out of like the second company that I had like bought into, and helped build and like ended a couple other projects. My husband and I were just running our carpet cleaning company. And I was trying to figure that out. Like I was literally like on the tail end of like, oh shit, I'm not going to die, but like, what's next? And so I just remember like speaking was the next thing for me, like telling my story. And I was trying to figure out what my next business move was, but she was right. And it was one of the things that actually, was the catalyst for me to go into coaching because I never wanted to be a coach. I actually had a really bad experience with coaching and like never wanted to be in that space. but it was the voice that actually challenged me to do that as I was like making those next decisions. And I still to this day don't even know the woman's name. Like, no idea who she was. There was some like relating factors there, but yeah, that would be mine right now. Like, it keeps coming up, and I'm like, that like her honesty in that moment was super impactful. If she would have been like just simply nice and been like, that was great and so inspiring. And I think that's the reason why these inspirational speakers are just not as impactful as they used to be. Like, we want real change. And that, I mean, that's a big part of why we do this podcast too, right? Like, giving people real tactics, real change, real things they can implement, not just like inspiring stories, which are good and totally valuable. But I think like there's enough of those in the world, especially with social media. Like, we can all click something to like get inspired. Like, what do we do with that? I think, and I didn't take it lightly. Like, I did something, I put some tools in place, I listened. And here we are today. So yeah, that's fine.
I love that. Kind of like a you never know who like you'll impact kind of story, you know, like you never know the impact you'll have on people. So we're going to talk about how we impact people today, specifically your what we call your ripple of influence. And this is for anyone who, if you feel like you're spread too thin, we talk to a lot of leaders and business owners, and they struggle to understand or to recognize and then ultimately define who they should be spending their time with. Where should they be putting their time? So there's lots of people who want your attention and want your time, and you're very busy. And who do you give it to? And how do you think about that critically so that you don't feel spread thin, and so that you're giving your best to the people that you should be, and truthfully to the people that deserve it? Because what we're going to talk about is that not everyone deserves that same level of access. And so let's start with who. I want to look at things from the start, from the leadership side. So from the individual, for the leader who is feeling spread thin, let's talk about what it looks like to identify and define why that's happening in the first place, and where we should look to focus our time and energy so that we can start to pour into the right people. And also too, we'll talk about this, like, so that it is also reciprocal, right? So when we talk about like who has access to us and who we are pouring into and who we give our time to the most, it should also like flow back in our direction. This is also the reason that we feel burnout and feel spread too thin, is that from a leadership perspective, we're pouring out and we're not getting anything back. And this is the key, is that we need to identify who the people are where it actually like support flows back upstream, right? It flows back in our direction. So Christine, set the stage for us. Like, what does that look like? What causes it for that like individual who is in a leadership position, who is feeling spread thin, burnout, overwhelmed, overworked, and just like too many people vying for their attention and time, and they need to remedy that?
Yeah, I think it's funny as you were kind of breaking that down, you use the word deserve, and like instantly, even still, I'm like, oof. Like, I'm sure for so many leaders, that concept that like people do or don't deserve your time is something that feels really hard for you. And I can totally relate. Like, I definitely have struggled. That feels very, like, I feel like I'm, like very prideful. I think when I first started looking at that, I'm like, oh, well, everybody deserves my time. Like, I don't want to like put something on people like that. And I think that's the number one thing that you're going to have to combat here, is realizing that not everybody deserves the same access to you. And if you disagree, you probably are going to continue to what I like to call peanut butter your time and like spread yourself too thin amongst too many things, too many people, and your impact is going to be shit. The reality is, if you don't learn to shift your mindset and realize that you are important, and anyone who makes an impact or a bigger impact and wants to expand their time has to understand that you only have so much capacity. And if you're running low on capacity, chances are you need to make a change. So the first step, just like maybe an AA, is like realizing that you have a problem and you're peanut buttering your time and you are important. And that's not prideful to say. And you, as a leader, if you want to be an impactful leader, then you're going to have to come to realization with that, and you're going to have to make a change. And then you can do it from a place of vision versus feeling bad about it. Like if you're experiencing guilt with that, that's normal. But the only way to overcome that is to do it and continue to do it, and to do it until it doesn't feel hard anymore. I remember when I first started sending out my calendar link, and like not everybody got the same calendar link. And not everybody needs an hour of your time. That's another thing that I've learned along the way. You know, you and I have like kind of actually diminished our time so much that like some people only get 10 minutes of our time. Some people only get 20 minutes of our time. And like that's actually can be really valuable. Like you can actually do that in a really intentional, impactful, intimate way where people feel valued. You just have to value your time first. So I'd say like that is baseline. You have to just like really challenge some of these things that have just been norms in your life, and then go from there. The other thing is you have to understand who belongs where. Like once you go, okay, not everybody deserves the same access to me. There's kind of a few buckets out that Taylor and I have break out for all of our clients. We have a really amazing process that we take everybody through, and we're going to actually give it to you guys today. But the first thing is, if you can kind of like envision a ripple, right? Like you throw a rock and like you have that in the water and you have that like ripple effect. Your first ripple is your main three people. Taylor and I always talk about, and like the foundation of this is realizing that you have three people in your life. Your top three people, your main three, are people who are mutually beneficial. They're your people who get the most access, and you are going to be the most vulnerable with those people, and vice versa. So these are very mutually beneficial relationships. They know you. They're your biggest cheerleaders. They're also the people who are comfortable pushing back on you. So this doesn't mean they're just your cheerleaders, but they're true like growth fans of you, and they know who you are. And if your three, the people you're giving the most to, don't know you at that level, then they're not your three, because they have to be able to know you well enough to be like, that's a shit idea. That's not in alignment with your legacy. That's a shit idea. That's actually not going to get you where you want to go. And you have to have that mutual trust and that relationship that allows you to show up and sharpen each other. They're the people who sharpen you, and you sharpen them. And then the next ripple is your 12. And so I always look at this and I'm like, Jesus himself did not have more than 12. So why do you think you have more than 12 that you're building? And these are your builders. These are your main people. And so, and they're like, they don't have as much access to you as your three, but they definitely have a lot of access. And the other mistake that I find leaders making in this space is that they actually put their 12, in a place where like they're just, and they're three, where they're just like giving. So like there's so much outpouring, there's so much that you're giving, and there's no receiving, like Taylor was saying, to where it's just like you are their supporters. These are actually your supporters. These are your builders. True leaders have builders. And those 12 builders are on board, and they're actually in alignment with your mission and your vision. And they're moving towards the same place, even if they're not doing the exact same thing. They might not work for you. They might have other things, but they're actually moving in the same direction. They care about the same things. They have core value alignments. And like, again, there's going to be kind of a mutual aspect to your 12. Then we kind of move out and we're looking at your 42. And like it's like considered like that start of the multitude, the places, then they don't have your phone number. They're not able to like pick up the phone and call you. They might not even have your email address. Directly, they might have your assistant's email address, and so that ripple, you definitely have a large impact on their life. They're probably not going to have a large impact on your life, besides maybe a transactional component there, or maybe they're your bigger people. So you might have like your 12 core leaders or managers in your organization, but then they're managing the rest. They're managing the like 42 or the multitude. And then we have the furthest ripple, and that would be our legacy. Those are people that you're going to impact that you might never even meet. That like you might not even be in the same generation as them. They might not even be on Earth when you're on Earth. And so we always want to be thinking for the legacy. But the way in which that we set up our ripples and the way we influence those ripples is going to dictate how big your legacy gets to be. And Taylor and I like to challenge people to think 100 years out. So Taylor, break this down a little bit more. How has this like looked for you, or looked for us within our organization? And like, what are the biggest shifts or changes that you've had to make because of thinking within this way, the 3, the 12, the 42, and the multitude, and then ultimately like that legacy view, that like 100-year out vision? What does that look like for you?
I think that the biggest thing I'll start with, or just to kind of reiterate, is that to get really clear on your 3. So for those of you listening, if you don't know who those people are, then let's start there, because that really sets the stage, and kind of sets the tone for how we think about valuing our time. Because what it does is it really puts like in stark contrast where we're spending our time in alignment with kind of our biggest impact and what we need to be impactful leaders. Because when you do that exercise, when you identify your 3, and then you look at your schedule, you're going to realize that your calendar doesn't reflect that, right? So really, you should be spending your most time with those people, in terms of what you're giving out. And then it should move out from there, right? So I think there's a real kind of like audit component that it really helps, because it puts things in very stark contrast, because you recognize that you're like, oh shit, like I'm not, I got to start there. And you got to know who your 3 are too. That might seem like an easy question, but I think when you really think about it, it takes a bit of work, right? Like you really have to, because there's a lot of people that you're probably really close to. Like, let's hope that you have a community that's full of people that you feel like are supportive and feel like are, you're close with. But again, these are like, these are your ride or die, right? Like I always say that about you, Christine. I'm like, all right, like if it all, like you're one of my 3. And I'm like, all right, well, if I had like a dead body to bury, like, that's how you want to think about it, right? You want the person to be like, all right, like, where are you parked? Let's get it done. So start there. Then the next most impactful thing for me that this exercise has highlighted is like what support looks like, right? So then we start to recognize that, like you said, Christine, it's like, okay, then it's like an outpouring, right? And you're like, you're giving. And in order for leadership to be sustainable and for our work to be sustainable, like it has to flow in our direction too, right? There has to be support. So then it really starts to highlight who gets my time and who doesn't, right? And I agree with you, Christine. Like that was something that I really struggled with, is this, just making that statement to be like, no, like, this person doesn't get, either they don't get my time at all, or they get a diminished amount of it, or I'm less available to that person. But also starting to think about like where can support come come in, right? So an example of that would be, yeah, maybe they don't get my time, but they could certainly get someone on my team's time so that I can still support them in like a secondary role, right? And so it doesn't mean that I'm not showing up for that person in a valuable way. I'm leveraging the relationships that I have available to me to help that individual, but it's not a direct pull of my time. And so there's some compartmentalization there that starts to take place that I think is really impactful, because you also start to, what that does is it starts to empower those around you, right? So if you relinquish and you free up your time, well, you didn't just cancel that. Like that has to go somewhere. So what you end up doing, in my experience, is you end up empowering those around you to take ownership over those relationships, or to play a support role in those relationships that allows you to remove yourself from them, but actually creates a great impact for that other individual because they're able to step into an ownership role in that particular way or within that relationship. And then on the support side of things, just identifying like, what does it look like to communicate in a way that that really asks for support, meaning identifying like when you're feeling spread too thin, when you feel like there's too much outpouring, to recognize the people that you can talk to and then ask for them to support you so that you get some of that time back. So the answer is not that we just continue to take on more. I think the answer is that when we recognize who is in our ripple of influence, we're able to really build relationships that are mutually supportive. And I think that's a challenging thing with leadership, because leadership is really about being in service of other people. That's something that you and I have talked about a lot, and we will continue to talk a lot about on this podcast. But leadership is not about people being in service to you. It is about us being in service to others, right? It's about providing an atmosphere and where people can step into their full potential and like take ownership over, over their lives and over the work that we're doing. And that is a service-based pursuit. And so there's an inherent aspect of that is giving. So this is why this is something that's so important. And I think also where so many people find themselves really frustrated and bogged down is because there's a delicate balance. And I think you have to just get really clear on like who those people are and be very, very adamant about how you value your time so that it's mutually beneficial. Again, you just can only have so much that you pour out, and then it has to come back to you. And so you need to be around those people where it flows back in our direction. And that's really, that's your 3. It gets a little bit less substantial with the 12, right? Like you're maybe getting a little bit of that, but it's certainly not mutual. You're probably giving more than you receive. That would be, people on your team, or, there's some like idea exchange. There's certainly a support component, but at the end of the day, like you're probably really responsible for them in some way. And so you really have to come back to your 3 and know who those people are and make sure that you spend, a substantial amount of time with them. So Christina, what's the support piece? Like, I want you to add some context there because, for no other reason, you're much better at that than I am. I think this is a place I've really had to push myself to grow. And this is why I can speak to like how massively impactful it is because it's amazing, like how much more fluidly and comfortably you can move through your days when you identify like who your people are and like how you allocate your time. Because it wasn't that long ago really that like everybody got the same, from a tactical perspective, like everybody got the same calendar link. Like I was having hour-long calls with everybody all day long, and I was, and I just didn't, and it was brutal. I mean, I just ran out of time, right? It just didn't make sense from like a the time that I needed to do things. But you have gotten there faster than I have, and you're much better at asking for support. So, because that's the other side of the coin. So we have like the leadership side, like this is like how it impacts you as an individual and how you move through the world. But then there's also the impact side. And so I talked a little bit about that. It's like it also starts to shift like the ownership and the autonomy and the trust equation to these individuals where you're actually making more of an impact. So it is a disservice to many people in your ripple of influence if you don't do this, because you're shortchanging them and you're kind of robbing them of their ability to like step in and take ownership over all of these different aspects that they could and should be taking advantage. If you just do it all and you give everybody the same time and you outpour and support and support and support, there are people out there that could be doing great work that you're stepping on their heels. And so I'll talk about the, like, what's that other side? Like, what's the impact side look like for those that are in our ripple? Once we've identified who they are, how then do we support them so that we can ultimately create that legacy? Because that's what we're talking about, right? Like it continues to go out. And when we do this, these are the people that like, you know, the next generation, right? Like we empower someone in our ripple to do something amazing so that someone in their legacy is impacted in a positive way. We might not ever know that, but that is absolutely what will happen. So speak to that, that support and like impact piece.
I think, yeah, this is something that like I think about so much, and like I think so many leaders struggle with asking for support, myself included. But I think that I've just had so many positive experiences where I get to feel really supported, and like I get to do the things, and I talk so much about our genius zone, right? Like I think this actually starts with understanding your genius zone. And I've had to do that because I have a very small genius zone. Like Taylor can do all of the things and he's really good at it. I cannot. Like there's a couple of different tests. Leading by your strengths is one of the tests that we use in our teams and the clients we work with, but it shows you your ability to like take care of all of the things and wear all the different hats. From like, I'm the conductor. That is my genius zone. I conduct very, very well. That's why I delegate really well. And like my husband and Taylor give me a lot of shit about it, because I'm like, if I don't want to do something, I'm just like, we're going to hire someone to do that. And like, it's not that I don't want to do it. It's just I'm not that good at that many things. I'm really, really good at like a few things. And then it gets really messy from there. And so I've had to learn because of that, like literally because I have a very large handicap. I like literally have to focus on the things that I'm really, really good at, or it's not a high quality. And that's very frustrating. But then the other side of that is I've gotten to watch, and one of the recent things is like hiring a private chef. Like that feels so freaking bougie and like over the top, but it's given me so much of my time back. It's been incredible. Like last night, I didn't have to think about dinner, and I absolutely love that. Also, the guy that we hired has told me so many times how being our private chef, he comes in, he drops stuff off. I like can heat it up. He has instructions for me. That has been incredible and saved us so much time and money, because I'm not like all the things. There's so many reasons. I won't go into it. I won't do that. But there's like so many reasons why it saved this money. And like when I first looked at it, I'm like, that's ridiculous. Like that's a bad investment. But I knew that I needed to free up that time and space because it just is too much for us as a family. We both own companies. Like it's just too much. Like we're not spending, and we were doing the delivery thing. And like, then you still have to like fight about what you're going to make or take out the meat or whatever it is. It just isn't, it's not worth it. But here's the impact piece. When we look at the impact, he's like, wow, I never serviced. We're having this conversation. He was dropping stuff off the other night. He's like, I've never serviced Highlands Ranch. And I was like, oh, you don't say. Like, this would be like totally your market. He's like, yeah, I didn't even think about servicing. He's like, since I've been bringing you meals, I literally have picked up 9 clients in this area. And I was like, oh, like, how did that happen? He's like, well, I joined a Facebook page and like, also saw people asking for different things, and I like put out a free meal thing, and like there was all these little pieces. Because I said yes to what I needed, he also built his business in this area. Now he's not driving out of the way. And like I have 100 stories like that. Also in our team, like it starts by like trusting people and like calling them into their genius zone. So we've hired people to do one thing, and then we needed something else. And instead of just like continuing to do it, we've gotten really, really clear that we need this thing. That person steps into it, and it always grows them. It grows their capacity. It grows. So I'm in pursuit of support. I'm like, hey, I need this thing. By just vocalizing that, someone on our team's like, oh, I can do that. Or hey, I know someone who can do that. And all of a sudden, this person who like didn't actually know or was not confident in that skill, they didn't value themselves in that way. They didn't explore that thing. All of a sudden they stepped into it because I trusted them, because I had a need, and like people want to help. And so I just always am bold with going, I need this. I don't want to do this. This doesn't sound fun to me. I'm not good at this, blah, blah, blah. And all of a sudden, lo and behold, like somebody rises to the occasion and they get valued and they get to have their impact because I'm not trying to do all the things. And I think as business owners and leaders, we have to think about our time like that. We have to be super freaking clear on our genius zone and what we're called to do. And I truly believe there's people who are called to cook and like be the private chef, and there's people who are called to lead companies and be the conductor. And it feels, even saying that, I'm like, it feels really shitty. Like there is like this rub every time I say it. I'm like, really? That's like all I'm going to do is conduct. And sometimes for people in my circle, they're like, you can't just delegate things. And there's a way in which that I get to do that actually creates my impact, because that's what I'm best at. Like seeing the vision, conducting the right people into the vision, that is what I'm best at. And I'm good at that every time. And I have no qualms about it when I'm in that seat. But where we get stuck is not being clear on our impact, not being clear on our vision, and then not being able to see that like, actually by you having a need, someone else gets to fill that need so they get to be valued. And so I think that's really important. Taylor, I don't know if that's what you were looking for, but I think that's the piece, that we're not thinking about how someone gets to grow and gets to be valued and gets to like expand their impact because we had a need. Like how many times do we just show up and we're like, oh, can you do this thing? And like, oh, I kind of need support. And we're kind of awkward and weird about it, versus just going, hey, I think you're the person. Like, can we just try this out? Can you just like fill this role and like, let's try it out. And if it's not your thing, great. I'm going to have you like build the process and then we'll hire for that. And all of a sudden, like, there's people who get to be valued and step in, and they get to provide for their family. Like there's so many get tos, but so many times we're like, I don't have the money. And it just turns into a scarcity conversation. Instead, we're like, oh, I can't do that. Oh, I can't. I couldn't possibly. Instead of going, how can I? I think that's the biggest shift for me. Instead of going, I can't, I'm like, how can I? How can we get there? And we just did that a couple of weeks ago with like a big project. I'm like, how can we? How can we do it? And like, that has to be a part of the situation and the conversation when we're looking at our ripple of influence. Because if we can stop and we can look at our ripple of influence, where does that person fit, or where does that support come from? If you're like, if it's a have to, chances are you probably need to look at that and either call yourself into your impact and into your genius zone, or you need the right support to get it done. So I think that's one of the pieces I'd encourage you on. Anyone who's thinking about this is like, how can you? And chances are there's probably someone else that needs to be in that equation so that we can make it happen. And then you don't have to be stuck in the roles and the like tasks that you don't want to do or that aren't serving you, and actually creating the impact that you want, because you can't do it alone. And that's one of the biggest things too. Like we've talked about that. If you think you can go, excuse me, if you think you can go make the impact that you want to make alone, you're probably going to be wrong, because you're not going to have, you have no ability to like expand or scale if you're by yourself. So that's what I would say. I don't know. Any final thoughts on that, Taylor?
No, that's great. I think, I think that is an important shift, right? To think about like, when we think about how we're leveraging our community and our network, start by thinking about like how we value our time, but then also thinking about the impact that like that value will provide, like when we invite others into that space, and I think that there's a communication component of that too, like you said, where when we communicate that from a place of like trust and ownership, and that really changes the dynamic too, right? Like I think the reason people struggle with understanding how to or actually like executing on how they divvy up their time within their network is that they're also the communication strategies associated with that are need to be nuanced, right? And that's a whole nother conversation. But like the way that I talk to you is going to be different than the way that I talk to somebody who is, several tiers out in my ripple of influence, to use the same analogy and metaphor. Is like, and so I think there is just an opportunity there to refine how we think about that communication so that it lands, and so that we actually like are doing that from a place of inviting people in versus even versus like delegation, right? Like, yeah, absolutely. Like get things off your plate, but like you doing that from I think people struggle to do that from a place that like actually lands. And so it ends up like coming back on them, right? Because the person, they just go round and round and they're like, well, fuck it, it's easier for me to just do it myself, right? Like how many times have we heard that? I mean, we've done that. I'm guilty of that. That really comes from a place of like understanding the value of your influence in that space to begin with, and how you connect with the individuals in that space at different kind of tiers or levels of that ripple, so that you can actually create an environment that person knows that they are trusted, right? And they know that like they can go out and do it. So just saying like, hey, I want you to run with this because like I don't have time for it, versus like hey, like I believe in you and I want to, like there's and it's easier said than done. Like I'm sure anybody listening to this was like, of course, like I don't want to sound like that, but like we do, right? But like, fuck it, like I don't want to deal with this. Like you just take it. Versus like, hey, I'd love your input on this. Like if you could, run point, like whatever the language is, right? There's just like communication strategy as we free up our time and value our time is like the next layer. We'll get into that in subsequent episodes. The communication piece is a big one for me. I think that's really like, from a leadership perspective, that's the number one thing we should be working on, right? If you are nothing else, you should be a professional communicator, and you should be really fucking good at it, or at least continue to work on being good at it.
I love that point of like your communication does sound different within the ripples, right? Like just like they have different access to the communication, and the information that they get is different. I think that's so key in this. And yeah, we all are guilty of that. And there's always training that goes along with that. And I think that like if we think about this and with the lens of impact, we have to realize that like you're gonna hand something off or someone something, and it's not gonna like be there overnight. There is training, and the reality is if you're truly impactful, you're gonna realize that like that's an investment. Like people in your ripple get a different investment, and like to hand something off to your builders, it's going to take time and you're going to have to invest in them. And that's a main part of the impact, right? Like that's something that like really should be showing up for. We really should be investing into, and it does take time. So I'm glad you made that point, Taylor, because delegation it doesn't happen without training and like investment of seeing that through. So thanks for like putting that final point on it. Cause I think that's a core problem that like, or mistake that most leaders make in the pursuit of finding the right influence and support mechanisms so that they can be impactful and like expand that capacity. So that's really good.
Yeah, I like to say like final just kind of point, like, delegation, without clear direction is management. Right? Like that's the difference, right? Like leadership is when we delegate with like clear communication and clear direction, so that person is empowered to like run with the thing that we've talked to them about. Like delegation without clear direction is management. That's when you've just given someone a task, and then you're going to have to follow up with them to see if that task was done. And you're going to be frustrated in the outcome because you didn't communicate expectations appropriately, and they didn't have the tools or the training, to your point, to do it. And so I think that's just another, recognizing that there is a difference. I think leaders so often are frustrated when they feel like they have too much on their plate because they can't get it off of their plate, but they're also, wanting to be leaders and behaving like managers, right? So make sure that like the communication is in alignment with your expectations, and make sure that like they have everything they need. Like when you delegate, when you, give somebody 15 minutes of your time versus an hour, like you have to communicate that effectively, right? They have to know why, and you have to be really impactful with that time. So lots of stuff to dive into for upcoming episodes. As a reminder, we will be releasing this podcast every Friday, forever and always. So you can look for that. For those of you that are joining us early on, please subscribe. Please rate this podcast on your favorite platform, and we would love it if you would share this podcast or your favorite episode with a friend. Help us get the word out there. It is the lifeblood of podcasts. We appreciate your early support. Thanks, everyone, for tuning in, and we'll see you next time on Impact Minded.